Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. Before I start today's episode, I just wanted to give a very quick announcement. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, I am currently pregnant, and I am now 8 months pregnant, which means that in about 2 episodes' time, I may just disappear for a while. So I just wanted to let you guys know that so that you're prepared. There may just be a sudden end to the episodes, but my plan is to basically just stop before the Cultural Revolution, and then probably in about September time, possibly even October, we'll pick up once again and we will go straight into the Cultural Revolution, so we're not sort of left on a cliffhanger. So back to today's episode, we're going back to talking about the pre-Cultural Revolution 1960s period, the era that sort of led up to the Cultural Revolution. In the last episode, we talked about economic recovery after the Great Leap Forward up until around 1965. In that episode, I wanted to set up the idea that there were 2 strands of governance going on in China at the time, the practical, or economic, and the ideological. Last week was all about the practical side of things, how China was going to stave off mass starvation, and how was the economy going to recover. This week we're focusing on ideology and how the political movements of the period 1962 to 1965 emerged as a sort of response to the slackening of socialist values, both in China's economy and in the communist world more generally. What I'm trying to highlight with this episode and the last episode is that it's actually quite difficult to identify where real power lay in China during this period. Even though the planners such as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping had worked hard to put China back on its feet, this didn't mean that they were in charge of the show, so to speak. Another battle was being fought, one that was almost entirely based on ideology and didn't rely on real-world results or fancy statistical models in order to succeed. Of course, probably the most important factor in this discussion is Mao himself, his personal ambitions, and the type of power that he was able to exercise. As he'd taken a blow with the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao made a series of moves throughout the early 1960s in order to regain his power and prestige. One of those moves was the launching of the Socialist Education Movement, which is going to be the main focus of today's episode. The Socialist Education Movement is an important precursor to the Cultural Revolution. It's one of those pieces that was put into place, something that helped ramp up the ideological battleground in China to a fever pitch. It's also the first stage in the breakdown of the relationship between Mao and his second-in-command, Liu Shaoqi. But before we talk about the movement itself, we need to talk about the state of socialism in China after the Great Leap Forward, how this affected Mao, and how the socialist education campaign that he launched was a direct response to what he felt was a threat to his own position. So, let's start in the countryside and talk about the communes. Well before the Great Leap Forward even took place, the peasants viewed the communization of the countryside as extremely disruptive, both because they disrupted the peasants' established way of life, and because their implementation was generally harsh and extreme in many cases. When they were first formed in 1958, many expressed the common sentiment that they had been introduced too early, too fast, and too rude. Of course, this was a deliberate move on the part of the party. Since land reform had been introduced way back in the early 1950s, the whole purpose of politics in the countryside had been to dismantle traditional ways of life and essentially force peasants to adopt communism as the only viable means of subsistence. The commune system was simply the next stage in this process. Unfortunately for the party, the main purpose and functions of the communes were undone almost as quickly as they had been introduced. As early as 1958, some of the functions of the communes had to be rolled back, and we discussed in the episode on the Great Leap Forward how some programs such as the universal canteen system had to be abolished within a year of being introduced. It turns out that the peasants had actually been right. The system had been implemented too quickly, without proper instructions or processes in place to make sure that they would actually work. Generally speaking, by 1962, the peasants' faith in the socialist system had been shaken by the famine, and the priority for peasants of all class backgrounds was now focused on producing enough food to eat rather than being good communists. These changes made during the Great Leap Forward, as well as the changes made afterwards from 1960 to 1962, led to several changes in the way socialism operated at the village level in the early 1960s, changes that Mao was not a fan of. The socialist mode of production was essentially unpicked by the new policies that were introduced by the Planners Group in 1961 and 1962, which we discussed in the last episode. Activities such as low-level privatization in farming and sideline activities by peasants to raise extra income had given rise not only to bad behaviours and attitudes by peasants and cadres, but also to the general erosion of socialist values and the re-emergence of some of the more pernicious traditions of the past. The main problems that needed to be corrected were 1. The spontaneous tendencies towards capitalism on the part of peasants, who had begun focusing more on private profit-making activities as opposed to collective undertakings. 2. A relaxation of social policies leading to the rise in untoward behaviours such as running private businesses and gambling. 3. The return of feudal behaviours such as marriage for financial reasons, the performance of old religious rituals, and the practice of witchcraft and sorcery. 4. A decline in cadre and peasant morale, mainly due to the 3 hard years, as 1959 to 1961 were generally referred to in China. And 5. The rise of the 4 uncleans, namely extortion of grain and money from local peasants, the concealment of surplus grain from state purchasing agencies, and the misappropriation of collective funds, grains, and properties for personal use. From Mao's perspective, cadres were basically just too easily bribed, complacent, or just straight up corrupt, and only a large-scale rectification movement that reintroduced socialist values to the countryside could solve this problem. But the countryside wasn't the only place that was losing its socialist spirit. In an effort to revitalise a demoralised intellectual community in the wake of the economic depression and the anti-rightist movement of 1959, the party decided to relax its control over intellectuals in the period 1961 to 1962, leading to a wave of critical publications, as scientists were given more control over their work, and writers embraced the party's new approach to free speech in the political sphere. Economists called for greater pragmatism and the introduction of a market economy. Scientists were trained in broad scientific theory, instead of being forced to focus on technical training aimed at aiding construction, and writers were encouraged to improve professionalism and try other styles apart from socialist realism, which had dominated throughout the 1950s. However, this was not to be a repeat of the 100 Flowers movement, where writers strayed into the political as opposed to sticking to their own fields. The party made it very clear: you can talk about academic subjects, but you cannot express your opinion about politics. Most intellectuals outside of the party basically ignored this sort of loosening and relaxing of rules, and refused to take part in the free discussions that had opened up to them, fearing a repeat of the previous opening up and purge combo campaigns that had been run in the past. However, a few intellectuals did speak up, and interestingly they were mainly party officials who themselves held positions either in the propaganda department or the Beijing Party Committee. Even more surprising was the fact that their commentary was usually directed at Mao and his policies, criticising moves such as mass mobilization and the dismissal of Peng Dehuai, who had dared to critique the excesses of the Great Leap in 1959. It's unclear why these officials suddenly felt emboldened to attack the most powerful man in the country, whether directly or indirectly, especially as leading figures in the party such as Liu Shaoqi or Deng Xiaoping never dared to do so themselves. It is possible, however, that they had the tacit support of people like Liu and Deng, who felt that they themselves couldn't be open in their critique, and so they sort of left other party members and officials below them in the propaganda sphere to sort of do it for them without punishing them, thereby making the critiques seem like they came from a more grassroots place. In Beijing, leading party members Peng Zhen, Deng Tuo, and Liao Mo-sha led the way in critiquing the Great Leap Forward and Mao, as well as the vice mayor Wu Han, a Ming Dynasty historian and former friend of Hu Shi. Hu Shi being the famous intellectual who had introduced the new rules for vernacular literature back in the May the 4th movement, but he was later demonized by the party for his support of Western ideals. So Deng, Liao and Wu teamed up and started writing these series of free-form essays, also known as zawen, called Notes from a Three-Family Village, which were subtle and indirect denunciations of Mao's cult of personality, current political policies, and events. In one of Deng's essays, entitled The Royal Way and the Tyrant's Way, he critiqued Mao's style of rule by contrasting the ancient historian Liu Xiang's definition of the royal way, which was combining human sentiments with law and morality, with the tyrant's way, which relied on authority and power, used violence and coercion, ordered others about, and robbed people by force or by tricks. In another essay, The Theory of Treasuring Labour Power, he again protested against the forced use of peasant labour for large-scale construction projects, pointing out that even in the ancient past, rulers knew the importance of caring for the people and the value of human labour. These zawen also addressed the role of intellectuals in general, pointing out that in the Ming dynasty and the Qing dynasty, for example, scholars were honest and brave and spoke out against unjust rulers whenever they could. One of the most important works produced in this period was the play Ha Rui Dismissed from Office, which was written by the historian Wu Han. It tells the story of the honest Ming official, Ha Rui, who tries to help peasants retake their land, which has been unjustly confiscated by landlords, and also tries to get justice for a peasant who had been killed by one of the landlord's sons. The local landlords appeal to the emperor, asking for them to spare the son and instead dismiss Ha Rui, to which the emperor agrees. It's understood that this play represents the plight of Peng Dehuai, who was ultimately dismissed for trying to help peasants during the Great Leap Forward. The play was released in 1961 and received good reviews at the time, but became an important touchstone for the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, which again we'll talk about in detail in a much later episode. In the propaganda department, famous May 4th writers like Mao Dun and former staunch supporters of Mao's literary policies like Zhou Yang teamed up to question the efficacy of Mao's leadership. Their main aim was to reinvigorate China's culture, encourage apolitical creation that appealed to a broad audience, and improve the quality of work produced. Many old plays from the 20s and 30s were revived and centered figures known as something called the middle character, which is a person who is not an idealized revolutionary hero who adored the party, but rather an ambivalent individual, someone who's caught between the old and new societies, and someone who's trying to reconcile the themes of class consciousness and revolution within their own lives. So we can see that the Socialist Education Movement was launched against two backdrops: an increasing marketization in the countryside and critiques from urban intellectuals. Both of these two things represented a loss of socialist values that Mao had been working very hard to cultivate, and even worse than that, a weakening of his own influence and the strength of his cult of personality. The Socialist Education Movement was really focused on the countryside, but there was an equivalent sort of rectification class struggle thing carried out in the cities at the same time against intellectuals. So I'll be talking about both of them today, but I'll just put them all under the moniker of Socialist Education Movement, as, to be honest, the aim was kind of the same thing, and the rural aspects of the campaign did touch on the urban intellectuals a little bit, as we'll see. So, in September of 1962, Mao made a speech at the 10th plenum of the Central Committee, in which he reaffirmed the importance of class struggle in the building of socialism in China. As part of his speech, he said, quote, "We must acknowledge that classes will continue to exist for a long time. We must also acknowledge the existence of a struggle of class against class, and admit the possibility of the restoration of reactionary classes. We must raise our vigilance and properly educate our youth as well as the cadres, the masses, and the middle and basic level cadres. Old cadres must also study these problems and be educated. Otherwise, a country like ours can still move towards its opposite. Therefore, from now on, we must talk about this every year, every month, every day. We will talk about it at congresses, at party delegate congresses, at plenums, at every meeting we hold, so that we have a more enlightened Marxist-Leninist line on the problem." The speech was the first indication that Mao intended to do something about the deviations that had taken place in the party line over the past couple of years. Though later he goes on to say that class struggle should not interfere with the overall work of the party, he also mentions that revisionism and the problem of the bourgeoisie should be tackled as they always have been, and that rectification movements was still an important tool used to correct behaviour. At the beginning of the speech, he also points out that the problems of commerce, agriculture, industry, and planning had already been sorted out, but those of, quote, class, the situation, and contradictions had not. In other words, the practical issues that we spoke about last week had all been discussed and figured out and dealt with by the planners, but the ideological issues were still on the table and needed dealing with. Just as a quick aside, I should also add that the Socialist Education Movement also should be seen in the context of the Sino-Soviet split, which we discussed in so much detail a few episodes ago over 2 episodes. Remember that in those episodes I explained that one of the critical reasons for the breakdown of Sino-Soviet relations was Mao's attempt to prevent revisionism at home. Mao essentially felt that the entire communist bloc was moving away from its revolutionary roots in trying to seek rapprochement with the West, and particularly with the US, with whom China had been feuding in the South China Sea. The Socialist Education Movement was part of Mao's plan not only to prevent the spread of revisionism from the USSR, but also to revitalise the revolution generally speaking, and bolster China's position as a leader of the original communist cause worldwide. The first stages of the Socialist Education Movement were actually initially launched in Hunan and Henan provinces in 1962, and then the model for those 2 provinces were then adopted and applied to other provinces over the following years. The official announcement that there would be a 4 cleanups campaign in the villages and a 5 antis campaign in the cities was made in February 1963 during a work conference. The CCP released a policy directive called the Draft Resolution of the Central Committee on Some Problems in Current Rural Work, which thankfully has usually been shortened to the first 10 points. So these were to give a basic outline of the problems that were to be solved, and also gave a little bit of guidance as to how to actually solve them. There were 2 main aspects to the campaign. The ideological aspect, which emphasised the need for continued class struggle through the dramatisation of the history of the revolutionary struggle through propaganda and education, and also the economic political aspect, which was reflected in the term the 4 cleanups, or siqing, which aimed to eliminate cadre corruption in accounts, granaries, properties, and work points. As a practical measure to try and actually run this campaign, throughout the country, poor and lower middle peasant associations were formed to oversee work on the 4 cleanups, without interfering in the administrative work of cadres. It was never really made clear what this actually meant, the sort of non-interference policy, and that became a problem later on in the campaign. But early on, there were some actual practical things done to correct the bad behaviour that had begun to grip the people of rural China. Local cadres were expected to get more involved in labour and spend less time on administrative work. They were given a minimum number of days that they were expected to spend on productive labour, 60 for county-level cadres and 180 for those at the brigade level. Also, the number of work points that cadres could claim for the performance of administrative tasks was greatly reduced to around 1 or 2% from between 4 and 10%. So this basically ensured that they actually did the labour time, otherwise they would risk losing out on pay. The idea was to reinforce socialist ideology without harming production, and in fact, using this method, the idea was to increase production, as the cadres were expected to focus more on labour than they were on the administrative side of their jobs. Higher level cadres were also sent down to the basic or brigade level in order to learn from their counterparts, and also take part in criticism and self-criticism sessions. There were also work teams formed that could reshuffle local political groups and formations, and their purpose was basically to actually shake up the local cadres, who had by this point been through so many campaigns that they knew how to survive pretty much unscathed, so this was a more targeted approach. Figures from Henan province in the early stages of the campaign seemed to prove Mao's theory that class struggle was necessary correct. Throughout April 1963, an investigation of 150,000 brigade-level cadres revealed that there were over 100,000 cases of speculation and profiteering, over 1,300 counter-revolutionary group activities, over 26,000 instances of landlords and rich peasants opposing the government, 8,000 secret societies and religious groups, over 50,000 witches, sorcerers, and geomancers, over 10,000 cases of maintaining family rights, and over 50,000 cases of marriages involving financial transactions. While the campaign proceeded at a more leisurely pace in other provinces, by the end of the year most provinces had completed this initial stage targeting the lower level cadres and were now moving on to investigate the county level. Propaganda played a very important role in the socialist education movement. One prime example was that of Lei Feng, a soldier in the PLA whose image was promoted as one of a selfless communist who was also devoted to Mao. Lei Feng had died in 1962, and his diary had been discovered and published as part of a nationwide Study Lei Feng campaign. The slogan, "Learn from Comrade Lei Feng," was published in newspapers across the country, extolling his virtues, and propaganda posters were made of his likeness, showing the many good deeds that he participated in. According to his diary, which was widely published, all Lei ever wanted was to be, quote, "a revolutionary screw that never rusts." In one entry, he described himself as, quote, "like a toddler, and the party is like my mother who helps me, leads me, and teaches me to walk. My beloved party, my loving mother, I am always your loyal son." His image and story are actually still used today, and March 5th is the official Lei Feng Day in China, though actually by now most people are quite skeptical as to whether or not he actually existed. But whether or not he did exist is actually kind of irrelevant. His use as a propaganda tool served its purpose pretty effectively, and he and other martyrs like him were a key part of rejuvenating devotion both to the socialist cause and to Mao himself. New forms of culture were also invented to support the movement. In 1962, the CCP launched the new Gushi movement, Gushi being a traditional form of vernacular narrative literature, appropriating the folk art form as a vehicle for the promotion of socialist values. New Gushi events were held in both urban centres and in the countryside, as thousands of amateur storytellers were mobilised to tell revised versions and adaptations of works that were popular at the time. It was a very accessible medium, as unlike plays or operas, it didn't require props or sets or makeup, but just a space like a meeting hall or a field or a factory where people could gather together. It was also effective in that many people were still illiterate at this time, and so the oral nature of the delivery was something that made it much more accessible. Often the stories were about the bad aspects of traditional values, for example, stories exposing greedy matchmakers who deceived families in order to turn a profit. Another tool used in the socialist education movement was something called a commune diary. Well, I call it a commune diary, at least, because they don't really have like an official name, but they do seem to have a unified purpose. Commune diaries were collections of village, family, and personal histories that served as critical teaching materials covering the revolutionary history and class struggle of a particular village or commune. I researched a bunch of these as part of my PhD, and so I became pretty familiar with the different styles and formats. While not all of them were created for the socialist education movement specifically, it seems that pretty much most of them were. Many of them had the express purpose of ensuring that the poor and lower middle peasants never forget class struggle. Another thing that unites them is the way in which they use statistics to show how unequal society was before liberation. In almost every single diary, you get like exactly the same figures. Landlord families owned 70 to 90% of all land, while poor peasants owned less than 10%. The majority of the villagers worked to service one or two big landlord families, who would exploit them cruelly, overcharge for rents, use child labour, and steal women. Apart from these similarities in content, most of them were different in presentation. For example, some of them are very short, like 100 pages, while others were well over 300 pages long. Some of them are also written from a first-person perspective and tell the stories of different individuals in villages, their family history, and how they personally overcame the brutality of the old system thanks to the guidance and liberation of the CCP. These are my personal favourite types because, to me, they're way more interesting than the ones that just tell sort of like a generic village history. They tend to be more forceful and brutal and harsh in their storytelling too. The ones that were written by poor and lower middle peasants associations, as opposed to like official historical writing teams, are always more effusive in their language, and they definitely focus on how bitter life was before the CCP came along. So I want to read you one of the stories from one of the diaries right now to give you an example of how local stories could be effectively turned into propaganda for class struggle and for the Socialist Education Campaign. So this is the story of Wang Bingkun. It's told from a first-person perspective, and it begins by talking about his family's poverty, followed by disaster. Quote, 2 years later, there was a drought, and not a single crop was reaped from the 8 mu of land that we rented from the landlord. In the 8th month of that year, the landlords Hu Shouting and Liu Chunsheng, not caring whether we had reaped anything, came to collect rent. My father said, "This year we reaped nothing. What do you want me to give you?" Leo roared, "If you don't have the money, return the land." My father feared that returning the land would make it even harder to make a living, and began pleading desperately. Hu cast his shifty eyes on us children, saying harshly, "There's no way you can raise this many little boys. Don't you think you should sell some to pay the rent?" I started crying and ran to my father's leg, gripping it tightly and not letting it go. My father stroked me, tears falling from his eyes. My father reluctantly agreed to sell me for rent, and the landlord finally swaggered out. After working the land for many years, the CCP finally came to liberate the village, and my family's fortune turned around completely. Just after land reform, I was able to get married and establish my career. Now I have 4 children. Our family totals 6 people, and by 1963 I had produced 3,200 jin, or 1,600 kilos, of grain, and become the head of the production team. So I think this diary entry in particular serves as a really good example of how the propaganda could be used in many different forms and even elevated from an individual level to mirror the collective good that the CCP has done for the entire country. The Commune Diaries was supposed to be an educational tool that was brought out again and again to remind people of class struggle and to continuously reinforce this ideology among the peasants. I don't actually know how successful they were in that regard, or if they were actually used as teaching materials in school or anything like that. I think they're just more useful in understanding how lower level cadres interpreted central policy goals, often quite literally. So if Mao said something like, "Hey, this village did a thing and I thought it was cool," then all of a sudden you would have the same thing popping up in all the villages across the land, and that's how this idea of the Commune Diary spread as well. Something that's also quite interesting about these diaries is that they're actually official documents. They were produced by actual regional publishers, some of them by like the central publishers in Beijing as well. So if I remember, I will try and put 1 or 2 pictures from some of the Commune Diaries on the Sino-Babel website, so you can see how the illustrations also accompanied the stories. They're quite simple, but again, they're very provocative and usually show a moment of high drama, such as mistreatment by landlords or the reuniting of families, things like that. So propaganda like that was used throughout the campaign, so throughout the main years of 1963 to 1965. In terms of the effectiveness of the actual socialist education movement, in the first stages of the campaign, punishments were relatively light. Cadres were generally allowed to redeem themselves through labour and intensive ideological indoctrination. Peasants who had engaged in activities such as capitalism or private farming were allowed to give up their practices voluntarily and engage with propaganda as their punishment. In the second phase, from September 1964 onwards, the movement accelerated and punishments intensified. People were publicly shamed, forced to participate in struggle sessions, and sentenced to labour reform. Problems with the campaign began to emerge. There was difficulty establishing exactly what spontaneous capitalist tendencies were and how they were different from, say, a legitimate sideline activity, for example, the raising of silkworms to make silk. Some things the party did approve of, as they genuinely helped boost local economies, but in other cases they didn't approve because they were seen as just for-profit activities. People felt persecuted without really understanding the reason why, and cadres were becoming increasingly demoralised as a result of the campaign. More and more, they shirked their responsibilities as they felt that the peasants' associations would just criticise them no matter what they did, and so in the end the campaign did end up affecting productivity, which is exactly the thing it was trying to avoid. In a speech made about the 4 cleanups in March 1964, Mao did address some of these problems, while still defending the need for the Socialist Education Movement. Quote, "We have not had class struggle for 10 years. We had one in 1952 and in 1957, but those were just in the administration organs and in the schools. This time we must do the Socialist Education campaign in the countryside as well, for at least 3 or 4 years. I say at least 3 or 4 years, otherwise 5 or 6 years. Some places plan to complete 60% this year, but we mustn't hurry. Haste makes waste. Of course, this is not to say that we can nibble away at it slowly. The problem is that the campaign has already begun. Henan is in too much of a hurry. It would be reasonable to say that this is a second land reform." And so the third stage of the campaign, from 1965 onwards, was basically aimed at rectifying the problems of the initial stages. There was a movement away from the persecutory nature of the campaign to a more positive side that sought to build up basic rural party organs in the economic and ideological fields. Greater emphasis was placed on the study of Mao Zedong thought and trying to resolve the contradiction between production and politics. Cadres and peasants were instructed to place politics in command of economics, and there was a pulling back of the persecution of cadres at the lower and middle levels. But in the end, the Socialist Education Movement was basically ineffective, or at least incomplete. Not only was the movement only completed in a few villages by the beginning of 1966, but the results were rather weak, as most of them had to be undone anyway. During the Cultural Revolution itself, it was revealed that many peasants and cadres had been erroneously labelled as counter-revolutionaries and had to be rehabilitated, and eventually the Socialist Education Movement was scrapped entirely by Mao and basically replaced by the Cultural Revolution. Many of those who had been punished during the Socialist Education Movement were exempted from struggle sessions during the Cultural Revolution, and those who had been in charge of carrying out investigations were replaced wholesale by the People's Liberation Army work teams. But if the Socialist Education Movement can be said to have not done very well in the countryside, then we can say it failed spectacularly in urban areas. Now, like I said, it wasn't actually called the Socialist Education Movement in urban areas, but again, there was the idea of class struggle and ideological education that was being pushed from 1963 onwards. Intellectuals often went along with the idea of renewed class struggle on the surface, but in reality they just continued to resist calls for the intensification of ideological education and actively sought to diminish focus on social class differences in all major institutions. They promoted a focus on unity within the intellectual sphere and actively introduced old forms of studies in universities, increasing the role of Western-educated intellectuals and focusing on raising academic standards and reducing the emphasis on political education and activism. A more favourable view of Confucianism was adopted due to its universal moral principles, and some even argued that principles such as ren, or benevolence, could be interpreted in a Marxist manner as a broad ethic for all classes to adopt. New, radical ideas about Marxism were also discussed. For example, the idea that peasants were actually not a revolutionary force, but rather a largely conservative group that desired power, and that in dealing with this group, concessions worked better than revolution. Economists continue to question the wisdom of the Socialist Education Movement and class struggle in the countryside, arguing instead that autonomy and profit should be favoured and a return to family farming should be encouraged. In an attempt to regain control over the intellectual sphere, Mao turned to a small number of close confidants, including his wife, Jiang Qing, and former Secretary Chen Boda, who worked on behalf of Mao to make connections with younger intellectuals to combat the older, established intellectuals who were critiquing the regime. 1963 to 1964 saw the rise of new radicals in support of Mao, and the rise to prominence of members of what would later become the Gang of Four, including Jiang Qing, literary critic and politician Yao Wenyuan, and political theorist Zhang Chunqiao. The young radical scholars that they worked with challenged senior writers who dared to critique Mao, arguing that the classes had nothing in common and that class struggle was paramount. The younger radical intellectuals represented China's new left, as well as a dissatisfaction on the part of the educated youth regarding the lack of mobility in the hierarchy and the inequalities between their older peers who formed the head of committees and editorial boards and themselves. They engaged in lively debates with their senior colleagues in newspapers and magazines, their focus on the importance of class struggle a portent of the Cultural Revolution. Their views enjoyed the support of Mao, who in 1963, in December, called the intellectuals out directly, saying, quote, "Problems abound in all forms of art. In many departments, very little has been achieved so far in socialist transformation. The dead still dominate. The social and economic base has changed, but the arts as part of the superstructure which serve this base still remain a serious problem." However, the intellectuals in positions of cultural authority didn't seem particularly moved, either by the young radicals or by Mao's words. When Mao made another speech in February of 1964, he was a bit more circumspect, but he still made remarks that were clearly a veiled threat against the haughtiness of intellectuals. For example, when he said, quote, "Only two of the emperors of the Ming dynasty did well, Taizu and Chongzu. One was illiterate, and the other only knew a few characters. Afterwards, in contrast, the Jiaqing reign, when the intellectuals had power, things were in a bad state. The country was in disorder. Han Wudi and Lo Huju were highly cultivated and ruined the country. It's evident that to read too many books is harmful. Liu Shui was an academic, whereas Liu Bang was a country bumpkin. Liu Bang being the first emperor of the Han dynasty, who was famously a peasant. These speeches foreshadowed the fierce anti-intellectualism that would grip the country during the Cultural Revolution. Again, however, the intellectual class didn't really seem to understand the implication of these sorts of statements, though they sent intellectuals down to the countryside as part of the Socialist Education Movement. They still refused to carry out any ideological reforms in their work or to hold struggle sessions among different classes. Mao felt that he had no choice, and in mid-1964 launched an official rectification movement. The cultural bureaucracy were not necessarily entirely against the idea of reining in criticism. They didn't want free speech necessarily, especially if it could end up undermining China's economic recovery. But where they differed from Mao was in their approach to tightening control over intellectuals. They essentially just refused to carry out a mass campaign, instead opting for the purge of very specific scapegoats, like we've seen before with people like Hu Feng and Ding Ling. But unlike those previous purges, this campaign was mostly carried out behind closed doors, and was very limited in its scope. The scapegoats often got off fairly lightly in comparison to past rectification victims, as they were still referred to as comrade. They weren't made to do any public self-criticisms, and really there was just no abject suffering involved. It helped that the campaign was diffused amongst several different people, as opposed to being focused on one individual, and also touched on multiple fields including philosophy, history, literary theory, cinema, the arts, and ideology. Though some prominent people were removed from positions of relatively high or middling rank in cultural and propaganda departments, realistically the bureaucracy went on as it had before. Most people were sheltered from attack, and the campaign ended up being more of a sign of pressure than the actual launching of bitter struggle. The rectification came to an end very quickly, without vitriol or fanfare, in 1965. The resistance and passivity of intellectuals during this period probably heightened the anti-intellectualism of the Cultural Revolution. sciences, arts, and humanities basically refused to budge and urged students to focus on becoming experts instead of thinking about their red credentials, as had been required during the Great Leap Forward. This essentially functioned as a signal to Mao that he should stop relying on the party and intellectuals to help him carry out the cultural revolution that he wanted so badly. But the Socialist Education Movement and the Cultural Revolution are not that intimately linked on the surface, besides the fact that they happened one after the other. The Cultural Revolution was primarily a reaction to urban-based ideological squabbles, whereas the Socialist Education Movement was mainly focused on rural rectification. The 16 points adopted by the Central Committee's 11th plenum on the 8th of August 1966 tried to forge a stronger connection between the two, stating that the Cultural Revolution enriches and elevates the Socialist Education Movement and adds momentum to the movement in cleaning up politics, ideology, organisation and economics. However, even the party had to admit that the Cultural Revolution and Socialist Education Movement were unique and separate, one more focused in villages and the other more focused on cultural and political leadership. This changed when the Red Guard movement started to emerge in the countryside, but that wasn't until a little while later. I won't go into too much detail today, as I want to save talk of the Cultural Revolution for the episodes on the Cultural Revolution, but just in general, it should be noted that on the 14th of September 1966, the Central Committee issued a document called Concerning the Great Cultural Revolution in Rural Districts Below the County Level, which basically replaced the Socialist Education Movement with the Cultural Revolution at the village level. So the Cultural Revolution wasn't just an outgrowth of the Socialist Education Movement. Many of those who were purged in the Socialist Education Movement, like I said, ended up being rehabilitated, and the work teams who carried out the work were replaced by the PLA. However, even without a very direct connection, we can still see that the Socialist Education Movement was a major step for Mao in regaining his precedence over ideology within the party. It was also just generally part of that turn of returning to socialist principles such as class struggle, which were essentially the foundations of the Cultural Revolution. It's also important to note that the Socialist Education Movement was never actually carried out to its conclusion, so it could have evolved into something Cultural Revolution-like, but I think it's kind of similar to the Great Leap Forward. The 5-year plans could have been carried out to their logical conclusion, but Mao basically just felt they were happening too slowly and so went for the Great Leap Forward. I think that's a similar thing that we see with the Cultural Revolution. He wants his power back, he wants the prestige back. All of these smaller movements aren't doing as much as he hoped that they would, and so it requires a bigger push, which is why the Socialist Education Movement is important, but it is often sidelined and people tend to just focus way more on the Cultural Revolution. In general, the early 1960s should be seen as this period of a ramping up or increasing of that class struggle ideology, that socialist ideology, and the return to the importance and the prominence of Mao's cult of personality. Okay, so that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget that you can sign up for the Sinobabble newsletter. Apologies that there was no news roundup, I think a couple of weeks ago, as I was away during that period. But every 2 weeks at least, when there is no podcast, there will be a longer form article discussing a piece of current political or social news in China, which will be analysed through a historical perspective. So you can sign up for that by going to Substack and searching for Sinobabble, or you can also sign up on the Sinobabble website. You can also choose to donate to the Sinobabble podcast if you wish by going to the sinobabble.com website and clicking on the donate button. You can choose to make a one-off donation or a monthly contribution. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you tune in next time.